Close your eyes with me. Tonight, I want you to imagine something strange. You have everything. A mansion with more rooms than you could ever use. Servants who appear before you even call. Gowns made of silk, shipped from the other side of the world. And yet you own nothing. Not your time. Not your body. Not even the thoughts you're allowed to speak aloud. Welcome to the life of a wealthy Victorian woman, where luxury was a cage lined with velvet, and boredom was practically a profession. The year is somewhere in the 1870s. Queen Victoria sits on the throne, mourning her dead husband with a persistence that would make grief itself feel inadequate. The British Empire sprawls across the globe like a possessive hand, and in the grand houses of London's finest neighbourhoods, women like you wake each morning to a life so carefully controlled, it makes modern prison schedules look relaxed. The irony? Everyone around you believes you're the lucky one. Here's the thing: you'd go absolutely mad within a fortnight. Not from hardship, but from the opposite. From the slow, suffocating weight of having nothing meaningful to do while being watched every single moment. If this is your first time here, welcome. I make these long, rambling history stories for people who want something calm to fall asleep to. If that sounds like your kind of thing, maybe hit subscribe and stick around for more. No pressure though. I'm just happy you're here tonight. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from. I'm always curious. Is it late where you are? Early morning? Somewhere in between? All right. Let yourself sink a little deeper into wherever you're resting. Slow your breathing, and let's step together into a bedroom that costs more than most people earn in a lifetime, a bedroom that somehow still feels like a trap. You don't wake up alone. That's the first thing you need to understand about being a wealthy Victorian woman. Privacy is not a luxury you're afforded, despite all the other luxuries piled around you like decorative armor. Before your eyes have fully adjusted to the dim morning light, before you've had a single coherent thought, there's a soft knock at your bedroom door. It's your lady's maid. She's been awake for at least 2 hours already, preparing for this moment, the moment you rejoin the land of the living. The room smells of lavender water and coal dust, a peculiar combination that somehow defines this era. Somewhere beneath you, in the basement kitchens, fires have been burning since 4 in the morning, sending warmth creeping up through the bones of the house. But your bedroom is still cool. The kind of cool that makes you reluctant to leave the cocoon of your blankets. Your maid pulls back the curtains just enough to let in a sliver of pale light. Not too much. A lady's complexion must be protected at all costs, even from the anemic English sun. Here's a curious detail historians love to mention. Many wealthy Victorian women didn't actually get out of bed for the first part of their morning routine. Breakfast in bed wasn't just for invalids or special occasions, it was standard practice for ladies of a certain class. A tray would appear, carried by a housemaid, containing weak tea and perhaps a slice of thin toast, nothing substantial. Appetite, like enthusiasm, was considered rather vulgar in a woman. You nibble at the toast. It tastes like obligation. Your maid moves quietly around the room, laying out the first of what will be several outfits today. Yes, several. The Victorians had a different dress for every conceivable activity, and changing between them was not optional. The morning dress she's preparing now is relatively simple, a high-necked affair in a sensible fabric, suitable for the domestic hours before you might receive visitors. But simple is a relative term. There are still buttons, so many buttons, hooks, eyes, tapes, laces, a small engineering project disguised as clothing. You push back the covers and swing your legs over the side of the bed. Your feet find slippers that have been warming by the fire. This small, comfort-warm slippers feels almost revolutionary. The floorboards would be cold otherwise, and a lady must never appear uncomfortable, even in private. Especially in private. You never know who might be watching. A servant, a sister-in-law, God himself, presumably, who the Victorians seemed to believe had very strong opinions about posture and the appropriate length of one's sleeves. The washing stand awaits you in the corner, a porcelain basin painted with roses, a pitcher of water that was heated downstairs and carried up by yet another servant. The water is barely lukewarm by now, but you splash your face anyway. The scent of rose soap rises faintly. This is your morning ablution, and it will be brief. Full baths are weekly affairs, elaborate productions involving hip baths dragged into the bedroom and endless kettles of hot water. For now, this will do. You pat your face dry with a linen towel, and your maid steps forward. And here's where the real work begins. Historians still argue about how long the average wealthy Victorian woman spent getting dressed each morning. Some estimates suggest a minimum of 90 minutes. Others push it closer to 2.5 hours for formal occasions. The truth likely varied by household, by season, by how many social engagements awaited. But one thing is certain, you could not do this alone. The clothing of this era was specifically designed to require assistance. It was a feature, not a bug. Independence was not the goal. Dependence was built into every seam, every hook, every lace that tied at the back where your own hands could never reach. Your maid begins with your undergarments, and there are more layers here than you might expect. First, a chemise, a simple cotton or linen shift that sits against your skin, protecting the more expensive outer garments from your body's natural humanity. The Victorians were deeply uncomfortable with the fact that humans perspired, and the chemise served as a barrier between your shameful flesh and your respectable clothing. Then drawers, which are essentially two separate leg coverings attached at the waist, open in the middle for practical reasons we don't need to discuss in detail. Over these goes a petticoat, then another petticoat. The Victorians believed in redundancy. You stand in the center of your bedroom, arms slightly raised, as fabric is layered onto your frame. The fire crackles softly in the grate. Outside, you can hear the distant clatter of a carriage passing on the street below, the early stirrings of a city coming to life. But in here, time moves differently. In here, you are being constructed, piece by piece, into the woman you are expected to be. Your maid reaches for the corset. The corset is not what you expected. You've heard the horror stories. Of course, women fainting at balls, ribs cracked and rearranged, organs compressed into unnatural configurations. And while some of that is true, some of it is also Victorian-era propaganda, designed to make women seem even more fragile than society already insisted they were. The reality is more complicated, more interesting, and honestly, more uncomfortable than outright painful. Your maid holds up the garment. It's made of sturdy cotton coutil, reinforced with whalebone, or rather, baleen, the flexible keratin plates from the mouths of filter-feeding whales. The Victorians called it whalebone because it sounded more elegant than whale mouth bristles, and elegance was everything. The corset is lightly boned, with channels sewn at regular intervals to hold the strips in place. At the front, a metal busk, a flat, rigid fastening clicks together like armor. At the back, laces wait to be pulled. You raise your arms. The maid wraps the corset around your torso, positioning it carefully so the busk sits flat against your sternum. Click, click, click. The front closures snap into place, one by one, and already you feel the structure taking shape around you. This is not squeezing. Not yet. This is architecture. The corset doesn't just compress. It supports, lifts, redistributes. It turns your natural body into a fashionable silhouette, the smooth, curved line that Victorian fashion demanded. Now come the laces. Your maid braces one hand against your lower back and pulls. The sensation is strange. Not painful, exactly, but insistent. The fabric tightens around your ribs, your waist, the soft flesh of your midsection. You exhale slowly, and she pulls again. The gap at the back of the corset narrows. You can feel your posture changing, your spine straightening, your shoulders rolling back almost involuntarily. The corset doesn't allow slouching. It doesn't allow much of anything. Really? Here's a mainstream fact worth noting. The much-discussed tight lacing that supposedly caused all those fainting spells was actually a fringe practice, not the norm. Most women laced their corsets to reduce their waists by only 2 to 4 inches, enough to create a fashionable shape, but not enough to cause the dramatic health consequences that later generations loved to exaggerate. The 18-inch waists you see in fashion illustrations were artistic fantasy, not everyday reality. Historians analyzing surviving corsets have found that the average waist measurement was around 22 to 26 inches snug. Certainly, but not the torture devices of popular imagination. That said, you're not exactly comfortable right now. The boning presses against your lower ribs when you breathe too deeply. You learn quickly to take shallow breaths, to let your chest rise gently rather than expand dramatically. This is how Victorian women breathed carefully, economically, as though air itself were rationed. Some researchers suggest this restricted breathing contributed to the stereotype of the fragile, swooning lady. When you can't take a full breath, even mild exertion becomes exhausting. The corset didn't just shape bodies, it shaped behavior. Your maid ties off the laces and steps back to assess her work. You catch a glimpse of yourself in the mirror across the room. The transformation is remarkable. Your waist curves inward, your bust lifts, your back forms a straight, elegant line. You look like a fashion plate come to life. You also feel like you're wearing a very polite hug that refuses to let go. But the corset is just the beginning. Over it goes. The corset covers a simple cotton garment designed to smooth the lines of the boning and prevent it from showing through your dress. Then the crinoline or bustle, depending on the decade. In the 1870 seconds, the enormous cage crinolines of earlier years have given way to the bustle, a padded or structured contraption that adds volume to the back of your skirt, creating that distinctive silhouette where women appear to be carrying a small shelf on their backsides. The bustle ties around your waist, and suddenly sitting down becomes a negotiation rather than an instinct. Here's a quirky tidbit that historians love to share. Bustles were sometimes stuffed with horsehair, cotton wadding, or even crumpled newspapers. Thrifty women made do with whatever provided the necessary poof. There are accounts of bustles catching fire when women backed too close to fireplaces, the stuffing igniting and causing chaos at otherwise dignified dinner parties. Fashion, it seems, has always carried an element of risk. More petticoats follow the bustle. Victorian women typically wore between 3 and 6 petticoats, depending on the season and the formality of the occasion. Each layer adds weight to your hips, fabric swishing against fabric as you move. The sound is oddly soothing, a soft, constant whisper that accompanies every step. You're beginning to understand why Victorian women were said to rustle when they walked. They were wearing enough fabric to upholster a small sofa. Your maid helps you into your morning dress. This involves more buttons than you can count. Tiny pearl things that march up your back in an endless regiment. She fastens each one with practiced fingers, her movements quick and efficient. This is her job. After all, she does this every single day, multiple times a day when you change for afternoon activities, and then again for dinner. The intimacy of the situation strikes you suddenly. This woman knows your body better than you do. She sees you half-dressed, vulnerable, human, and yet you probably don't know her last name. The dress settles into place, and you examine yourself again. High collar, long sleeves, fitted bodice, full skirt, cascading over the bustle. You look respectable. You look wealthy. You look like exactly what you're supposed to be, a lady of quality, ready to face a day of doing very little while appearing to be terribly busy. But your maid isn't finished yet. She guides you to the dressing table, where an array of brushes, combs, pins, and mysterious implements await. Your hair must be styled. And this is not a simple ponytail situation. Victorian hairstyles were elaborate confections of braids, rolls, curls, and waves. held in place by an arsenal of hairpins and sometimes supplemented by false pieces called rats or switches. Your maid takes up a brush and begins the slow, rhythmic work of taming your hair into submission. The sensation is pleasant, actually. The gentle pull of bristles against your scalp, the quiet intimacy of someone caring for you. You watch in the mirror as your hair is twisted, pinned, and arranged into something that resembles a small architectural project. The smell of pomade scented with violet or rose fills the air as she smooths flyaways into place. Nearly 2 hours have passed since you first opened your eyes. You have accomplished nothing except becoming presentable, and yet you're already tired. You descend the staircase like a ship navigating treacherous waters. Each step requires careful negotiation with your skirts, your bustle, and the general physics of moving while wearing what amounts to a small tent. The banister is cool beneath your gloved fingers, yes. You're wearing gloves indoors now, light cotton ones for morning wear, because bare hands are apparently inappropriate even in your own home. The Victorians had opinions about everything, and exposed skin was near the top of the list. The breakfast room awaits you on the ground floor. It's smaller than the formal dining room, more intimate, with windows that overlook the back garden, where frost still clings to the rose bushes. The smell of bacon and kidneys drifts from the sideboard, rich and heavy, mingling with the sharper scent of strong tea. A fire burns in the grate, popping occasionally as the coals settle. The room is warm, almost stuffy after the relative chill of your bedroom, and you feel a bead of perspiration threaten to form beneath your corset. You ignore it. Ladies don't perspire, they glow, at most. The sideboard is laden with enough food to feed a small army. This is the Victorian breakfast in all its excessive glory. A parade of silver chafing dishes keeping various proteins warm, a rack of toast going progressively colder, pots of jam and marmalade, butter molded into decorative shapes, eggs prepared 3 different ways, and something that looks suspiciously like fish. Kedgeree, probably. The Victorians inherited it from British India's smoked haddock mixed with rice, hard-boiled eggs, and curry powder. It sounds strange, but it's actually rather good. Not that you'll be eating much of it. Here's a mainstream fact that might surprise you. Wealthy Victorian women were expected to eat like birds in public, regardless of their actual appetite. A hearty appetite was considered masculine, even coarse. Ladies picked at their food, took small bites, and never under any circumstances appeared hungry. This was particularly true at dinner parties, but the habit extended to breakfast as well. You serve yourself a single piece of toast, a smear of butter, perhaps a spoonful of eggs. Your plate looks almost empty compared to what a man of the household might consume. You sit at your designated place at the table. If your husband is present, and in many households, he's already left for his club or his business affairs, conversation is minimal. Breakfast is not a social meal. It's fuel, consumed quickly and efficiently, a necessary pause before the real work of the day begins. The silence is broken only by the clink of cutlery against china, the rustle of newspaper pages, the distant sounds of servants moving through the house. The toast is cold. It's always cold. By the time it travels from the kitchen, in the basement, up the stairs, and onto the sideboard, any warmth it once possessed has fled entirely. You chew mechanically, washing each bite down with tea that's gone slightly tepid. The taste is familiar. Unremarkable bread, butter, the faint bitterness of tea leaves steeped too long. This is not a meal to be savoured. This is a meal to be survived. Within 20 minutes, breakfast is over. You dab your lips with a linen napkin, push back your chair, and prepare for the first real task of your day. Correspondence. Your morning room is a small sanctuary on the first floor, decorated in pale blues and creams, with a writing desk positioned near the window to catch the best light. This is your domain, one of the few spaces in the house that belongs primarily to you. Here, surrounded by stationery and sealing wax, you conduct the invisible business of Victorian social life. And make no mistake, it is business. as complex and demanding as anything happening in the men's offices of the city. The desk is already piled with the morning's post. Your butler has sorted it, of course, separating the cards and invitations from any actual letters, arranging everything in order of apparent importance. You settle into your chair, a delicate affair upholstered in silk that offers approximately zero lumbar support, and survey the damage. There are calling cards from yesterday's visitors, each one requiring acknowledgement, invitations to dinners, musicales, charity events, a note from your dressmaker about a fitting, a letter from a distant cousin requesting a favor, and dozens of cards that communicate information through an elaborate code of folded corners and cryptic abbreviations that would baffle any modern observer. Here's a quirky tidbit that historians find endlessly fascinating. Victorian calling cards were a language unto themselves. A card with the upper right corner folded meant the visitor had called in person. Upper left corner folded indicated congratulations. Lower right meant goodbye, as when leaving town. Lower left expressed condolence. All four corners folded meant the card was meant for all members of the household. There were also abbreviations penciled in corners P, F for pour féliciter, to congratulate, P, C for pour condolences, P, C for prendre congé, to take leave. You needed essentially a decoder ring to navigate polite society. You pick up the first card and examine it. Mrs. Hartley Worthington called yesterday at 3 o'clock. Upper right corner folded. She came in person, but you were out, or rather, you were not at home, which is Victorian code for, I'm here, but I don't want to see you right now. Now you must return the call within a week, or risk committing a social offense that could ripple through your entire circle. The pressure of this feels absurd, and yet it's absolutely real. Your pen scratches across paper as you begin composing responses. The sound is oddly soothing, the soft scrape of nib against linen stationery, the occasional pause to dip into the inkwell. The ink smells of iron gall, slightly acidic, mixing with the lavender sachets tucked into your desk drawers. You write in a careful, slanted hand, the penmanship drilled into you since childhood. Each letter must be perfectly formed. Sloppiness suggests a sloppy mind. Some scholars argue that this elaborate correspondence system gave Victorian women a form of power within their restricted sphere. They controlled social networks, determined who was invited where, managed the complex web of obligations and favors that bound upper-class society together. Others suggest it was merely busy work, a way of keeping women occupied with trivialities while men handled real affairs. The truth, as usual, probably lies somewhere between. By noon, your hand aches from writing. You've responded to 14 cards, declined 2 invitations, accepted 3, and composed a carefully worded letter to your mother-in-law that says absolutely nothing while filling 2 full pages. This is a skill, the art of writing at length without communicating content. Victorian women perfected it. The carriage awaits you at the front door, a sleek black brougham with your family crest discreetly painted on the door panel. The coachman sits rigid on his perch, breath misting in the cold air. The horses stamping impatiently against the cobblestones. You gather your skirts, accept the footman's gloved hand, and climb into the velvet-lined interior. The door closes behind you with a satisfying thunk, and suddenly the noise of the street becomes muffled, distant, as though you've entered a small, rolling room that belongs to a quieter world. The seat is cold, despite the hot brick wrapped in flannel that's been placed on the floor for your feet. You arrange your skirts around you, taking up far more space than seems reasonable for a single human being. The bustle makes sitting an exercise in geometry. You perch slightly forward, your back never quite touching the seat, maintaining the posture that your corset demands. Through the small window, London slides past in a parade of grey stone and iron railings. Pedestrians hurrying along pavements, street vendors calling out their wares, in voices that penetrate even the carriage walls. This is the morning call, and, despite its name, it rarely happens in the morning. Here's a mainstream fact. that confuses everyone who first encounters it. Morning calls in Victorian England actually took place in the afternoon, typically between 3 and 5 o'clock. The morning in question referred to the time before dinner, which in fashionable households didn't occur until 8 or 9 in the evening. So your morning stretches luxuriously across most of the daylight hours, a linguistic quirk that perfectly captures the Victorian talent for making simple things unnecessarily complicated. The carriage jolts over a particularly uneven patch of road, and you brace yourself against the leather strap hanging near the window. The smell inside is a mixture of leather polish, your own perfume, a light floral scent applied sparingly to your handkerchief, and the faint mustiness of velvet that's absorbed decades of London fog. Outside, a newsboy shouts something about Parliament. A dog barks. The rhythm of the horse's hooves creates a steady percussion beneath everything else. Your first stop is the home of Mrs. Ashworth, a woman you barely know but whose acquaintance you must cultivate because her husband recently received a knighthood and everyone is suddenly very interested in being her friend. The carriage pulls to a stop before a handsome townhouse in Belgravia, white stucco gleaming even under the overcast sky. You don't actually expect to see Mrs. Ashworth. That's not really the point. The footman opens your door and helps you down. You approach the front steps, your card case clutched in your gloved hand, a small silver affair engraved with your initials, containing perhaps 24 of your personal calling cards. These rectangles of cream-colored Bristol board are your social currency, more powerful in some ways than actual money. You extract one, fold the upper right corner to indicate you've called in person, and present it to the butler who has materialized at the door with the silent efficiency of a particularly well-trained ghost. "Is Mrs. Ashworth at home?" you inquire, knowing full well that the answer depends on dozens of factors that have nothing to do with Mrs. Ashworth's physical location. The butler's face reveals nothing. "I shall inquire, madam." He disappears into the dim interior, leaving you standing in the entrance hall, not quite inside, not quite outside, suspended in a social purgatory that could tip either way. The hallway smells of beeswax and hothouse flowers. Lilies, probably. Their heavy sweetness almost cloying. A grandfather clock ticks somewhere deeper in the house. You wait. This is what you do. You wait. Here's a quirky tidbit that reveals the absurdity of the whole system. A lady could be sitting in her drawing room, fully dressed for visitors, completely available, and still instruct her butler to say she was not at home. This wasn't considered a lie, it was a social fiction that everyone understood and accepted. Not at home meant I don't wish to receive you today, and no offense was meant or taken. The rejected caller would simply leave her card and try again another time. It was rejection wrapped in such thick layers of politeness that it barely stung at all. The butler returns. Mrs. Ashworth is, apparently, not at home. You feel nothing. This is expected, even normal, particularly when calling on a new acquaintance. You've done your duty by leaving your card. Mrs. Ashworth will do hers by returning the call within a fortnight. The dance continues, step by careful step, until eventually you might actually have a conversation with this woman you're supposedly so eager to befriend. Back into the carriage, on to the next house. The process repeats. Your second call is more successful. Mrs. Pemberton is at home, and you're ushered into her drawing room for the prescribed 15 minutes of polite conversation. The room is overstuffed in the Victorian fashion, every surface cluttered with ornaments, photographs in silver frames, artificial flowers under glass domes. The wallpaper is a deep crimson that makes the space feel smaller and warmer than it probably is. Mrs. Pemberton sits on a settee upholstered in a fabric that clashes magnificently with the walls, and you lower yourself onto the designated visitor's chair positioned. You notice, slightly lower than your hostess's seat, a subtle reminder of who holds power in this particular exchange. The conversation is pleasant and utterly empty. You discuss the weather, which has been unseasonably cold. You mention a mutual acquaintance who has recently been confined, the polite term for being in the final stages of pregnancy and therefore socially invisible. You admire a new ornament on the mantelpiece, a porcelain shepherdess that Mrs. Pemberton imported from Dresden. You do not discuss politics, religion, money, scandal, or anything remotely interesting. These topics are forbidden in mixed company, and even among women alone, they're approached with extreme caution. Historians still debate what women actually talked about during these ritualized visits. The official record suggests endless discussions of household management, fashion, and family news. But some scholars argue that the drawing room was where real information was exchanged. Rumors, warnings, strategic advice passed between women who understood that knowledge was its own form of currency. The 15-minute limit on calls meant these exchanges had to be efficient, coded, layered with meaning that a casual observer might miss entirely. The mantel clock chimes the quarter hour. Your time is up. You rise, exchange the appropriate pleasantries, and retreat to your waiting carriage. 3 more calls await you this afternoon, and the light is already beginning to fade toward the early winter dusk. You settle back against the cold leather seat and watch the city pass by through the small window. Your feet are numb despite the hot brick. Your back aches from sitting bolt upright for hours. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you're already calculating tomorrow's obligations, who must be called upon, who must be avoided, who has slighted whom, and what the appropriate response might be. The social machinery never stops turning, and you, perched in your velvet-lined carriage, are just another cog. The carriage takes a different route now, moving away from the pristine white townhouses of Belgravia towards streets that grow progressively narrower, progressively greyer. The cobblestones become more uneven. The buildings lose their gleaming stucco facades and reveal bare brick, soot-stained and crumbling in places. The smell changes too. The faint perfume of hothouse flowers and beeswax gives way to something sharper, more honest: coal smoke, rotting vegetables, the unmistakable tang of too many bodies living too close together without adequate plumbing. You are going to do charity. This is not optional. A wealthy Victorian woman was expected to engage in philanthropic work, to spread her beneficence among the deserving poor like butter across particularly unfortunate bread. It was considered part of your duty as a Christian, as a woman, as a member of the upper classes who had been blessed by Providence and therefore obligated to share those blessings with the less fortunate. The fact that this sharing rarely involved any actual sacrifice on your part was beside the point. The gesture mattered. The appearance of compassion was almost as good as the real thing. Your destination is a mission hall in one of the poorer districts, a squat brick building that serves as a distribution center for soup, blankets, and moral improvement. You helped establish this particular charity 3 years ago, which means your name appears on the letterhead, and you're expected to make periodic appearances to demonstrate your continued interest. The work itself is done by paid matrons and volunteer visitors, women of the middle classes who have fewer social obligations and more time for actual labor. Your role is primarily decorative. You are the Lady Bountiful, dispensing grace simply by existing. The carriage stops, and your footman opens the door with visible reluctance. This is not the sort of neighborhood he enjoys visiting. You step down onto cobblestones, slick with something you choose not to examine too closely, and gather your skirts away from the mud. The mission hall door opens, and a middle-aged woman in a severe grey dress emerges to greet you, Mrs. Finch, the matron, who actually runs this operation with terrifying efficiency. Lady Ashford, how good of you to come. Her tone is perfectly respectful, and somehow also suggests that your presence is both expected and slightly inconvenient. You've interrupted actual work with your need to be seen doing good. Inside, the hall is warm and crowded. The smell hits you immediately: cabbage soup, unwashed wool, damp clothing, and beneath it all, the sour note of poverty itself. That particular scent of bodies that haven't been properly clean in weeks. You try not to wrinkle your nose. Ladies don't notice unpleasant smells. Ladies float above such earthly concerns, sustained by lavender sachets and sheer force of will. Here's a mainstream fact about Victorian charity. It was deeply, fundamentally concerned with distinguishing between the deserving and undeserving poor. The deserving poor were those who had fallen into poverty through no fault of their own: widows, orphans, the sick, the elderly. These people merited assistance. The undeserving poor, on the other hand, were those whose poverty was blamed on moral failings, laziness, drunkenness, loose behavior. These people merited lectures at best, punishment at worst. The entire charitable apparatus of Victorian England was designed to sort people into these categories and treat them accordingly. You move through the hall, Mrs. Finch at your elbow, providing a running commentary on the good works being accomplished. Women in worn shawls sit on wooden benches, waiting their turn to receive whatever is being distributed today. Soup, probably, and perhaps some second-hand clothing that ladies like yourself have donated. Children cling to their mothers' skirts, watching you with wide eyes. You smile at them. It costs nothing to smile. A small girl, perhaps 5 years old, reaches out a grubby hand toward the silk of your dress. You freeze. Her mother yanks her back with a horrified apology, scolding the child for daring to touch a lady. The girl's face crumples. You want to say something kind, something that would make this better, but the words stick in your throat. What would you even say? That you don't mind? But you do mind. A little. The hand was dirty. The dress is French silk, and there's something uncomfortable about being touched by poverty, as though it might be contagious. Here's a quirky tidbit that reveals the strange contradictions of Victorian philanthropy. Many charity organizations required the poor to attend religious services or moral instruction classes before receiving any material aid. You couldn't just be hungry, you had to be hungry and willing to sit through a lecture on temperance, or thrift, or the spiritual dangers of idleness. Some missions made recipients sing hymns in exchange for soup. The body could not be fed without first attending to the soul, even if the soul in question would have much preferred a sandwich and a warm coat without the accompanying sermon. You find yourself stationed at a table where bundles of clothing are being distributed. Mrs. Finch has handed you a pair of gloves, plain cotton, not your good kid leather, and you're apparently expected to actually hand items to the women who approach. This feels dangerously close to real work. You smile, pass over bundles, murmur encouraging things about warmth and providence. The women who receive your charity curtsy, thank you profusely, avert their eyes. The transaction is oddly uncomfortable on both sides. One woman lingers a moment longer than the others. She's younger than you expected, with a face that might have been pretty before hunger and exhaustion carved it into sharper lines. She's holding an infant wrapped in a shawl so thin you can see through it. "God bless you, ma'am," she whispers. "God bless you for your kindness." You want to say something real, something that acknowledges her as a person rather than a recipient, a fellow human being rather than an object of charity. But the words don't exist in your vocabulary. Your entire education has prepared you for drawing room conversation, for the delicate art of saying nothing elegantly. It has not prepared you for this, for looking into the eyes of someone whose life is genuinely difficult and finding something meaningful to say. "You're most welcome," you manage. I hope things improve for you." She nods, clutches her bundle, and moves away. You feel like a fraud. Some historians argue that Victorian women's charity work, despite its condescension and moral judgment, represented a genuine expansion of women's public role. It got them out of the house, gave them organizational experience, and allowed them to develop skills that would later fuel movements for suffrage and social reform. Others suggest it was merely a pressure valve, channeling women's energy into activities that didn't threaten the existing order. The poor stayed poor, the rich stayed rich, and everyone felt slightly better about the arrangement. By the time you return to your carriage, your cotton gloves are smudged with something unidentifiable, and your heart feels heavier than when you arrived. The footman helps you up with obvious relief. The door closes, the velvet interior embraces you once more, and as the carriage pulls away from the mission hall, you find yourself wondering what that young mother's name was. You never thought to ask. The carriage delivers you home just as the clock in the entrance hall strikes one. The sound reverberates through the house, deep, resonant, slightly reproachful, as though time itself is keeping track of your movements and finding them barely adequate. You hand your soiled cotton gloves to the waiting housemaid, who whisks them away to some unseen realm where unpleasant things are dealt with by people who don't have the luxury of not dealing with them. Your outdoor things are removed, the heavy cloak, the bonnet with its complicated ribbons, the good kid gloves you wore over the cotton ones because layers, always layers. You emerge from this cocoon of fabric feeling lighter and somehow more exposed. Luncheon awaits. You might think that lunch would be a simple affair. A sandwich, perhaps, a bowl of soup, something quick and practical to bridge the gap between breakfast and dinner. But this is Victorian England, and nothing is ever simple. Even the most casual meal must be transformed into an occasion, complete with silver, crystal, fresh flowers, and an underlying current of anxiety about whether you're performing femininity correctly while consuming food. The dining room has been prepared for what the household considers an informal meal, which means only 2 footmen are present instead of 4, and the tablecloth is merely Irish linen rather than the Belgian damask reserved for dinner parties. The table could seat 14, but today it's just you. Your husband lunches at his club, as gentlemen do, and any children old enough to eat solid food take their meals in the nursery with their governess. This vast, polished expanse of mahogany exists for you alone, a single place setting positioned at its head like a lonely island in a sea of wood. You sit. A footman materializes to push in your chair. Another footman appears with the first course, a clear soup, amber-colored and glistening, served in a delicate bowl with handles shaped like swans. The smell is subtle, beefy, with undertones of sherry and something herbal you can't quite identify. You pick up the appropriate spoon. Soup spoons are rounded, remember, and you scoop away from yourself, never toward, and begin the careful work of eating without appearing to eat. Here's a mainstream fact that explains the peculiar Victorian relationship with food. Women of your class were caught in an impossible bind. They were responsible for managing elaborate households that revolved largely around the production and consumption of meals. Yet they themselves were expected to show minimal interest in actually eating. A healthy appetite suggested a lack of refinement, even a certain animalistic quality that proper ladies were supposed to have transcended. So you learned to toy with your food, to take small bites, to push things around your plate in patterns that suggested consumption without actually requiring much of it. The soup is followed by a fish course, a small portion of sole in butter sauce, the flesh flaking delicately under your fork. The taste is rich, almost too rich, after the charity hall's cabbage-scented air, and you find your appetite more present than usual. You eat perhaps half of what's offered before setting down your fork in the position that indicates you're finished. The footman removes your plate without comment. His face betrays nothing, though somewhere in the servants' hall, the cook will receive word that my lady didn't care for the sole, and there will be quiet consternation about what this might mean. A meat course follows the fish. Cold chicken, sliced thin, accompanied by a salad of watercress and cucumber. Then a sweet, a small custard in a crystal dish, trembling slightly as it's placed before you. You eat a spoonful, maybe 2. The vanilla coats your tongue, smooth and comforting. Finally, fruit and cheese appear, though you touch neither. 4 courses for a light lunch. The Victorians had a very particular definition of light. Here's a quirky tidbit that speaks to the elaborate theatre of Victorian dining. In many households, the footmen were selected partly for their appearance. Tall, handsome footmen were status symbols, displayed during meals like particularly attractive furniture. Some households even required their footmen to powder their hair in the old-fashioned style, a practice that had died out in regular society but persisted below stairs as a mark of a truly grand establishment. The footman pouring your water right now might have been hired as much for his calves as his competence. You're not supposed to notice this. You notice anyway. The silence of the dining room is broken only by the soft clink of your cutlery, the occasional creak of a footman shifting his weight, the distant sounds of the household continuing its work beyond these walls. Somewhere below, the kitchen staff is already beginning preparations for dinner, a far more elaborate meal that will require hours of work and dozens of dishes. The scullery maid is probably elbow deep in greasy water right now, scrubbing the pots from your breakfast and this lunch. Her hands red and raw from the harsh soap. You don't think about her. You're not supposed to think about her. The entire system is designed so that you never have to think about the people who make your comfort possible. You dab your lips with a napkin and rise from the table. 35 minutes have passed. You've consumed perhaps 800 calories, if that, spread across enough courses to suggest a feast. Your corset feels tighter than it did this morning, not because you've eaten too much, but because you've been sitting in it for hours, and the boning has begun to shift against your ribs in ways that promise bruises by evening. You ignore the discomfort. Ladies always ignore the discomfort. Some historians have argued that the Victorian woman's restricted diet was a form of bodily control that mirrored her social restrictions. Just as she was not permitted to move freely through the world, she was not permitted to nourish herself freely either. Others suggest that the small appetites were genuine, the result of tight lacing that compressed the stomach and made large meals physically uncomfortable. Still others point out that many women ate quite heartily in private, maintaining the performance of daintiness only when observed. The truth, as with so many things, probably varied from woman to woman, household to household. What's certain is that you're vaguely hungry most of the time. Not starving, the food is plentiful enough but never quite satisfied either. There's always a slight hollowness beneath your ribs, a whisper of want that you've learned to interpret as refinement rather than deprivation. This is what being a lady feels like, you've come to understand. It feels like being almost enough, almost full, almost comfortable, almost free. The almost is the point. Complete satisfaction might lead to complacency, and complacent women are dangerous women. Better to keep them just slightly hungry, slightly uncomfortable, slightly aware that perfection remains forever out of reach. The afternoon stretches before you. More obligations await. You smooth your skirts, check your reflection in the mirror above the sideboard, and prepare to receive visitors. Today is Thursday, and in your household, Thursday means you are at home. This phrase sounds innocuous enough. Of course you're at home. Where else would you be? But in the coded language of Victorian society, it carries specific weight. Being at home means you have designated this afternoon as your official receiving time, the hours when you will accept visitors in your drawing room and engage in the elaborate ritual of social display. Every woman of your class has her at-home day, printed on her calling cards and memorized by everyone in her circle. Lady Hartington receives on Tuesdays, Mrs. Pemberton on Wednesdays, you on Thursdays. The schedule is sacred, inviolable, more rigid than most religious observances. You've changed your dress, of course. The sensible morning gown has been replaced by something more elaborate, an afternoon dress in deep garnet silk, trimmed with black velvet ribbon, and a modest amount of jet beading that catches the light when you move. The bustle has been adjusted, the hair repinned, fresh gloves procured. You've been reconstructed for the second time today, transformed from the woman who visited charity halls this morning into the woman who receives callers this afternoon. They are not quite the same person, though they share a body and a name. The drawing room has been prepared with equal care. Fresh flowers arranged in crystal vases, hothouse roses in January, a small fortune in petals. The fire built up to a comfortable blaze. The best china laid out for tea, though tea won't be served until 4 o'clock, and it's barely 2:30. Chairs have been positioned at precise angles, close enough for conversation but far enough apart that no one's skirts will overlap. The room smells of roses, coal smoke, and furniture polish, a combination so familiar it's become the scent of your social life. You settle into your designated seat, a high-backed chair near the fireplace that offers the best light and the most commanding view of the room. This is your throne for the afternoon. From here, you will hold court, receive supplicants, dispense the currency of your attention in carefully measured doses. The clock on the mantelpiece ticks steadily, counting down the minutes until your first visitor arrives. You wait. This is what you do. You wait, beautifully arranged, like a painting that happens to breathe. Here's a mainstream fact about Victorian at-home days. They served as the primary mechanism for maintaining and expanding social networks among the upper classes. In an era before telephones, before email, before any form of instant communication, these weekly receiving hours were how women stayed connected. You learned who was ill, who was traveling, who had given birth, who had died. You heard rumors and confirmed facts. You negotiated alliances and smoothed over conflicts. The drawing room was a command center disguised as a parlor, and the woman who sat at its heart wielded more influence than most men would ever acknowledge. The first knock comes at precisely 3 o'clock. Your butler announces Mrs. Worthington and her daughter, a pale young thing of perhaps 17, who's clearly being introduced to society under her mother's watchful eye. They enter in a rustle of silk and nervous energy, the daughter hanging slightly behind, as though hoping to disappear into her mother's substantial shadow. You rise, extend your hand, murmur the appropriate greetings. Everyone sits. The ritual has begun. Conversation flows along its prescribed channels. The weather is discussed unseasonably cold. Everyone agrees. Though what would seasonable cold even look like in January? The daughter's upcoming debut is mentioned, and you offer vague encouragement that costs nothing and commits you to nothing. Mrs. Worthington inquires after your husband's health, your household's well-being, and you provide answers that are pleasant and entirely uninformative. The clock ticks. 15 minutes stretch like taffy, each second somehow both interminable and fleeting. Here's a quirky tidbit about the mechanics of at-home visiting. In very grand households, the butler would actually time the visits, appearing at precisely the 15-minute mark to announce a new arrival, real or fictional, thereby signaling that the current guests should take their leave. This saved everyone the awkwardness of overstaying their welcome, while maintaining the fiction that the departure was prompted by external circumstances rather than boredom or social obligation. Some visitors, particularly those considered boring or presumptuous, found that new arrivals appeared with suspicious frequency during their calls. Mrs. Worthington and her daughter depart, and before you can catch your breath, the next visitors arrive. Mrs. Ashworth, the same woman you called upon earlier today and found not at home, has apparently recovered from her indisposition and is now returning your visit. You greet her with warmth that's entirely performative. Settle her into the best guest chair and begin the whole process again. Yes, the weather is cold. Yes, the season promises to be lively. Yes, you're very much looking forward to Lady Something or Other's ball next month. The words could be spoken in your sleep. Perhaps they are. The afternoon becomes a blur of faces, of silk and feathers, and the faint rustle of calling cards being exchanged. Your drawing room fills and empties like a tide governed by social rather than lunar forces. The tea things are brought in at 4, and you preside over the ritual, pouring milk first or after, 1 lump or 2. The sacred geometry of cup and saucer and silver spoon. The tea is strong and hot, a small pleasure in an afternoon of performing pleasantness. You take a sip between visitors, feel the warmth spreading through your chest, and wonder if this is what contentment feels like, or just its convincing imitation. Some scholars argue that the rigid formality of Victorian visiting served a protective function, particularly for women. The rules created structure, predictability, safety. You always knew what to expect, what was expected of you, how to behave in any given situation. There was comfort in that certainty, even if it came at the cost of spontaneity. Other historians suggest that the formality was itself a form of control, a way of channeling women's social energies into activities that reinforced rather than challenged the existing order. The endless visiting, the elaborate etiquette, these kept women busy, gave them a sense of purpose and importance, while ensuring they never had time or energy to question whether the system itself made any sense. By 5 o'clock, the last visitor has departed, and the drawing room feels emptied out, exhausted, as though the walls themselves need a moment to recover. The flowers are drooping slightly in their vases, wilted by the heat of the fire and the accumulated breath of a dozen women. The tea things sit in disarray, cups half empty, cake crumbs scattered across the good tablecloth. Servants materialize to clear it all away, to restore order before dinner, to prepare the room for tomorrow's emptiness. You remain in your chair a moment longer than necessary, staring at the fire. Your face aches from smiling. Your voice has gone slightly hoarse from hours of careful conversation. And yet you've accomplished nothing tangible, no work produced, no problems solved, no art created or knowledge gained. You've simply performed. For hours, the role of lady, of hostess, of social creature. And tomorrow you'll do it again. And the day after that. And the day after that. Until the season ends. Or you do. The fire crackles softly, settling into its embers. Outside, the early winter darkness has already fallen, pressing against the windows like a curious observer. You finally rise, smooth your skirts, and prepare for the next transformation. Dinner approaches. Another costume change awaits. The performance never truly ends, it only changes venue. But before dinner, there is shopping to be done. Not the kind of shopping you might imagine, no pushing through crowded aisles, no hunting for bargains, no carrying your own bags like some kind of pack animal. Victorian shopping, for women of your class, is an entirely different species of activity. It is performance, ritual, theatre. It is sitting in velvet chairs while merchandise is brought to you, sipping tea while assistants flutter around like anxious birds, and never under any circumstances handling money directly. That's what accounts are for. The crass exchange of currency is something that happens elsewhere, invisibly, between your husband's secretary and the shop's ledger books. You merely point at things, and they become yours, as though by magic. Your carriage deposits you on Regent Street, that long, curving boulevard of commerce that serves as the beating heart of fashionable London shopping. The gaslights are already lit against the gathering dusk, their yellow glow reflecting off rain-slicked pavements and plate glass windows. The street hums with activity carriages jostling for position, pedestrians weaving between them, shop boys in aprons darting out to assist customers, or sweep the steps clean of the ever-present London mud. The air smells of horse, of coal smoke, of roasting chestnuts from a vendor on the corner, and beneath it all, the strange metallic tang of a city in the throes of industry. You're heading to Swan and Edgar, the great draper's establishment at Piccadilly Circus, though Draper's hardly captures the scope of what this place offers. It's a palace of fabric, a cathedral of consumption, 4 floors of silk and wool and cotton, and things you didn't know you needed until you saw them displayed under the flattering glow of gas chandeliers. The building itself is imposing classical columns, enormous windows, the kind of architectural grandeur usually reserved for banks or government buildings. Commerce, in Victorian England, has become its own religion, and these shops are its temples. The doorman recognizes you, or pretends to, which amounts to the same thing, and ushers you inside with a bow that manages to be both obsequious and dignified. The interior unfolds before you like a dream of abundance. Counters stretch in every direction, draped with fabrics in every conceivable color and texture. Shop assistants in black dresses and white collars stand at attention, ready to spring into action at the slightest indication of interest. The smell shifts as you enter now, its sizing and starch, the particular scent of new fabric, mixed with the beeswax polish on the wooden counters and something floral, probably the perfume of the half-dozen other ladies already browsing the ground floor. Here's a mainstream fact about Victorian shopping that might surprise you. The concept of the department store as we know it was essentially invented during this period. Before the 1850 seconds, shopping meant visiting individual specialized shops, one for gloves, one for ribbons, one for fabric, one for ready-made items. The great department stores changed everything, gathering all these goods under one roof and transforming shopping from a practical errand into a leisure activity. For women especially, These stores offered something unprecedented, a respectable public space where they could spend hours without a male chaperone, browsing, socializing, even eating lunch. The department store was, in its way, a small revolution. You're guided to the silk department, where a chair has been produced from somewhere and positioned at a comfortable distance from the counter. You sit. Tea appears, offered on a small tray by an assistant whose sole job seems to be ensuring your comfort while you spend money. The transaction has begun, but it doesn't feel like a transaction. It feels like a visit, a social call where the merchandise is merely an excuse for the interaction. The shop assistant begins presenting silks for your inspection. Bolt after bolt is unrolled across the counter, waterfalls of fabric in sapphire and emerald, and a deep rose that would look magnificent as an evening gown. You reach out to touch them. This is permitted, even expected, and the sensation is extraordinary. Cool and smooth beneath your fingertips, slippery in a way that suggests luxury, quality, expense. The fabric whispers as the assistant handles it, a soft shushing sound that's strangely soothing. You could fall asleep to that sound, you think, the rustle of silk being presented for approval. Here's a quirky tidbit that captures the elaborate theatre of Victorian shopping. In the best establishments, customers were never expected to ask the price of anything. Doing so would be vulgar, a suggestion that cost might influence your decision. Instead, prices were either marked on small, discreet tags that you could examine without comment, or simply sent along with the goods when they were delivered to your home and added to your account. Some ladies genuinely had no idea what things cost. Their husbands handled such details. The shop handled such details. Money was a river that flowed around them, invisible and unmentioned. You select 3 lengths of silk, the sapphire, the rose, and a cream that will do nicely for a summer afternoon dress without ever discussing what they cost or how you'll pay. The assistant notes your choices in a leather-bound book, marks them for delivery, and thanks you with a warmth that seems almost genuine. Perhaps it is. You've just spent more on fabric than most of the shop girls earn in a month. Gratitude seems appropriate, but you're not finished. Shopping, like the rest of your day, follows its own elaborate choreography. From Swan and Edgar, you proceed to a milliner on Bond Street, a tiny shop, exclusive, where hats are created as individual works of art, and the waiting list for a new bonnet can stretch to 6 weeks. The interior is dim and cluttered, boxes stacked to the ceiling, the smell of feathers and straw, and the particular mustiness of stored fabric. Madame Celestine herself emerges from the back room to greet you, pins bristling from her bodice like armor, a measuring tape draped around her neck like a ceremonial chain of office. You're shown sketches of new designs, feathers and flowers, and elaborate constructions that seem to defy both gravity and good sense. Victorian hats are not subtle affairs. They are architectural statements, perched atop carefully arranged hair and secured with pins long enough to serve as weapons in an emergency. The current fashion favors height and forward tilt, creating a silhouette that makes you look perpetually surprised. You examine the sketches, make approving noises, request a small adjustment to the trim on one design. Madame Celestine nods, as though you've said something profound. Some historians view Victorian shopping culture as an early form of consumer capitalism, training women to find fulfillment through acquisition rather than creation. The endless cycle of fashion, new silhouettes each season, new colors, new trimmings, ensured that no wardrobe was ever truly complete, that satisfaction remained perpetually out of reach. Others argue that shopping offered women genuine pleasure and agency, one of the few areas where their choices mattered and their tastes were taken seriously. The shops courted female customers, catered to their preferences, treated them as important. In a world where women had so little power, that recognition, however commercially motivated, must have meant something. Your final stop is a glove maker, where you're measured for 3 new pairs, white kid for evening, tan for afternoon calls, black for morning should the need arise. The glovemaker's hands are soft and precise, as he measures the circumference of your palm, the length of your fingers, the span from wrist to knuckle. The intimacy of it is startling. This stranger knows the exact dimensions of your hands, information more precise than most people in your life possess. You watch his fingers move against yours and feel suddenly, strangely seen. The carriage carries you home through streets now fully dark, the gaslights creating pools of yellow against the encroaching black. Packages will arrive tomorrow, the silks, the hat when it's finished, the gloves in their tissue-lined boxes. You've acquired things today, though you haven't actually brought anything home. That's how it works. The goods appear later, like memories of a pleasant dream, and someone else deals with the practicalities of payment and delivery. You simply exist at the center of this consumer universe, a planet around which commerce orbits, waiting for your nod of approval. The clock strikes 4, and something shifts in the atmosphere of the house. It's subtle, a slight quickening in the servants' movements, a particular attention to detail that wasn't present an hour ago. The fire in the drawing room is stoked to precisely the right height. The curtains are adjusted to block the last grey dregs of afternoon light, while allowing the warm glow of lamps to dominate. And somewhere in the depths of the kitchen, a kettle is beginning its slow journey toward boiling. The hour of tea has arrived. You might think tea is simply a beverage, a drink, something you consume because you're thirsty or because caffeine helps you survive the afternoon slump. But in Victorian England, tea is none of these things. Tea is a ritual, a religion, a social institution as complex and rule-bound as any ceremony performed in Westminster Abbey. The taking of afternoon tea is not about thirst, it's about civilization itself, performed daily in drawing rooms across the empire. A reminder that whatever chaos exists beyond these walls, here, at least, order prevails. The tea things are already laid out. You noticed them earlier during your at-home hours, but now they take on new significance. The silver tea service gleams on its tray, polished that morning to a mirror shined by a housemaid whose name you've never learned. The china is your best Wedgwood, pale blue with white classical figures frozen in eternal elegance around the rims. Cups so delicate you can see the shadow of your fingers through them when you hold them to the light. Saucers that ring like bells if you tap them with a fingernail, though of course you would never do anything so vulgar. Here's a mainstream fact that explains how this ritual came to dominate British life. Afternoon tea was essentially invented in the 1842 by Anna Maria Russell, the Duchess of Bedford. She complained of a sinking feeling during the long gap between lunch and dinner which, as fashionable dinner times crept later and later into the evening, had stretched to 7 hours or more. Her solution was to request a small meal of tea, bread, and butter be brought to her private rooms in the afternoon. The habit spread among her aristocratic friends, and within a generation, it had become a national institution. One woman's hunger became an empire's obsession. The tea itself arrives in a silver pot, wrapped in a quilted cozy to keep it warm. Your lady's maid, or sometimes you yourself, if the company is intimate enough, performs the sacred act of pouring. This is not as simple as it sounds. There are decisions to be made, allegiances to declare, milk first or tea first. The question has divided British society for generations, with passionate advocates on both sides. The milk first faction argues that adding cold milk to an empty cup protects the delicate china from cracking when hot tea is poured in. The tea first faction counters that you can better judge the strength of the brew and adjust the milk accordingly. Friendships have been strained over this question. Marriages have weathered worse storms. You pour the tea first. You've always been a tea first household, and tradition must be maintained. The smell rises with the steam, rich, slightly tannic, with undertones of bergamot if you've chosen Earl Grey, or the more straightforward malty notes of Assam. The warmth of the cup in your hands is comforting, a small pleasure in an afternoon of performed pleasures. You raise it to your lips and sip, feeling the heat spread through your chest. For just a moment, nothing else exists but this, the taste, the warmth, the quiet satisfaction of a ritual performed correctly. But tea is not merely tea. Tea requires accompaniments, and these too follow strict protocols. There are sandwiches cut into delicate triangles or fingers with the crusts ruthlessly removed. Cucumber is traditional, as is egg salad, smoked salmon, or potted meat. There are scones served with clotted cream and strawberry jam, and here another great debate emerges: cream first or jam first. The Devonshire method puts cream on the scone before jam. The Cornish method reverses the order. Wars have not been fought over this question, but strongly worded letters have certainly been written. Here's a quirky tidbit that reveals the obsessive nature of Victorian tea culture. Etiquette manuals of the period devoted pages, sometimes entire chapters, to the proper handling of teacups. The cup should be lifted from the saucer when drinking. The saucer should remain on the table if you're seated at a table, but held beneath the cup if you're standing or seated on a sofa. The pinky finger should never be extended. That's a myth, a misunderstanding of aristocratic gesture that somehow became fixed in popular imagination. The spoon, after stirring, must be placed on the saucer behind the cup, never left standing in the tea like a flagpole claiming territory. The stirring itself should be silent, a gentle back and forth motion rather than the circular clanking of a barbarian. You navigate these requirements without thinking, your hands moving through the motions with the ease of long practice. Lift, sip, replace. The tea is perfect. Strong but not bitter. Hot but not scalding. The sandwich you've selected is cucumber, the thin slices almost translucent against the white bread. The whole thing so light and insubstantial, it barely qualifies as food. You eat it in 3 small bites, each one a performance of delicacy. Ladies don't bite, ladies nibble. Ladies make the consumption of a sandwich look like an act of supreme refinement rather than the satisfaction of base hunger. The drawing room is quiet now, the parade of afternoon visitors having departed. It's just you and the tea things, the fire crackling softly, the lamp casting warm pools of light across the carpet. This is what passes for solitude in your life, not true aloneness. Because servants hover just beyond the door, ready to appear at the ring of a bell, but something adjacent to it. A pause in the performance, a moment when no one is watching, or at least no one whose judgment you fear. Some scholars have argued that the ritual of afternoon tea created a feminine space within the Victorian household, a time and place where women held unquestioned authority. The drawing room during tea was the lady's domain. She decided who was invited, what was served, how long visits lasted. The tea table was her throne, the silver pot, her scepter. Other historians suggest this authority was merely decorative, a shadow of real power that kept women occupied with trivialities while men made decisions that actually mattered. The truth, as always, probably contains elements of both. You reach for a scone. The texture is perfect, crisp on the outside, soft and slightly crumbly within, still warm from the oven. You split it with your fingers, because using a knife would be incorrect, and apply first the cream, then the jam. You are a Devonshire woman in your scone preferences, though you've never actually been to Devonshire. The first bite is small, careful, delicious. The sweetness of the jam mingles with the richness of the cream, and beneath it all, the subtle, savoury note of the scone itself. For this one moment, eating feels like pleasure rather than obligation. The fire settles, sending a small shower of sparks up the chimney. Outside, the last light has faded entirely, and London has surrendered to the early darkness of winter. In houses across the city, similar scenes are playing out: women pouring tea, selecting sandwiches, navigating the intricate choreography of cream and jam. There's something almost comforting in the thought. This vast network of tea tables and silver pots and women performing the same rituals at the same hour, connected by custom if nothing else. You set down your cup and lean back slightly in your chair, as much as the corset allows. The tea has done its work. The sinking feeling, if you ever had one, has been held at bay for another day. Soon you'll need to go upstairs and begin the lengthy process of dressing for dinner. But for now, for just these few remaining minutes, you can simply sit, simply breathe, simply exist in the space between obligations, watching the fire and feeling the last warmth of the teacup fading against your palms. The clock ticks toward 5. The ritual is complete. And somewhere in the kitchen, servants are already beginning the preparations for the next meal, the next performance, the endless cycle of consumption and display that structures your days like a trellis structures a climbing vine. You grow in the shapes you're given. Everyone does. The tea things have been cleared away, and you find yourself alone in the drawing room with a strange, familiar sensation settling over you. It starts as a heaviness behind your eyes, a slight flutter in your chest, a weariness that seems to come from somewhere deeper than mere tiredness. You've felt this before. You feel it often, actually, this creeping exhaustion, this sense of being overwhelmed by nothing in particular. The Victorians have a name for it, of course. They have names for everything. They call it nervousness, or neurasthenia, or sometimes simply the vapors. And if it persists, if it deepens, if it begins to interfere with your duties as a wife and hostess and ornament, they might call it something else entirely. They might call it hysteria. You sink back into your chair, one hand pressed lightly against your forehead in the universal gesture of feminine distress. The room suddenly feels too warm, the corset too tight, the weight of the day too heavy. Your maid appears as if summoned by telepathy. Perhaps she was watching through the crack in the door, alert to any sign that you might need attending. She produces a small glass vial from her apron pocket and waves it beneath your nose. The smell hits you immediately. Sharp, acrid, eye-wateringly pungent. Smelling salts, ammonium carbonate mixed with perfume, designed to shock your system back into alertness through sheer olfactory assault. You gasp, jerk your head back, and feel suddenly, violently awake. The heaviness recedes, replaced by a ringing clarity that's almost worse. The smelling salts have done their job. You are revived. You are functional. You can continue performing your role for another few hours at least. Here's a mainstream fact that explains much about Victorian women's health. The diagnosis of hysteria was applied so broadly and so frequently during this period that it essentially became a catch-all category for any female complaint that doctors couldn't otherwise explain. Fatigue, hysteria. Anxiety, hysteria. Irritability, sadness, anger, frustration, or any other emotion that made men uncomfortable. Hysteria. The word itself comes from the Greek hystera, meaning uterus, reflecting the ancient belief that women's emotional problems originated in their reproductive organs. Victorian doctors inherited this theory and ran with it, creating an entire medical industry around the treatment of a condition that may never have existed as they understood it. Your own doctor, Dr. Pemberton, no relation to the missus. Pemberton, you received this afternoon, though wouldn't that be convenient, has visited you several times over the past year for complaints that resist easy categorization. You've described headaches that come and go without pattern, a persistent fatigue that no amount of rest seems to cure, a feeling, sometimes, of being trapped in a body that doesn't quite belong to you, going through motions that have lost their meaning. He's listened with the grave attention that doctors cultivate, nodded wisely, and prescribed the usual remedies. Rest. That's always the first prescription. Rest, rest, and more rest. The famous rest cure developed by Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell in America has become fashionable among physicians treating nervous women, and your own doctor is an enthusiast. The treatment is simple in theory. Complete bed rest, isolation from family and friends, a diet of milk and bland foods, and absolutely no intellectual stimulation of any kind. No reading, no writing, no conversation beyond what's necessary for basic care. The idea is that the nervous system, overstimulated by the demands of modern life, needs to be essentially shut down and rebooted, like a machine that's overheated. Here's a quirky tidbit that reveals the strange logic of Victorian medicine. Some doctors believed that thinking itself was dangerous for women. The brain, they argued, competed with the reproductive organs for vital energy. A woman who read too much, or studied too intensely, or engaged in any form of intellectual labor was essentially diverting resources away from her uterus and toward her brain, a reallocation that could lead to infertility, hysteria, or both. Education for women was therefore not just unnecessary, but actively harmful, a medical risk to be managed through careful limitation of mental activity. The fact that this theory conveniently justified keeping women ignorant and dependent was, presumably, entirely coincidental. You haven't undergone the full rest cure, not yet, anyway, but you've been prescribed its gentler cousin, the afternoon lie down. Every day, between tea and dinner, you're meant to retreat to your bedroom, loosen your stays, and recline on the chaise longue with the curtains drawn. No visitors. No activities. Just you and the quiet and the slow tick of the clock on the mantelpiece. It's meant to restore your nerves, to husband your energy for the demands of evening. In practice, it feels like solitary confinement with better furniture. You rise from the drawing room chair and make your way upstairs, your maid trailing behind, with the smelling salts still clutched in her hand, just in case. Your bedroom has been prepared for the ritual rest, the chaise positioned near the window, a light blanket draped over its foot, the curtains half drawn to create a dim, womb-like atmosphere. You lower yourself onto the cushions and allow your maid to begin the partial unlacing of your corset. Not fully removed, that would take too long, and you'll need to be dressed again for dinner in an hour, but loosened enough that you can take a proper breath for the first time since morning. The relief is immediate and almost overwhelming. Your ribs expand, your lungs fill. The spots that have been dancing at the edges of your vision all afternoon recede. You didn't realize how shallow your breathing had become until this moment, when depth is suddenly restored. The corset, loosened, still shapes you, but it no longer constrains. You lie back against the cushions and stare at the ceiling, where shadows from the half-drawn curtains create shifting patterns in the afternoon gloom. Some historians argue that many cases of Victorian hysteria were actually the body's reasonable response to unreasonable circumstances. Women trapped in loveless marriages, denied education and meaningful work, corseted into immobility, and expected to perform endless social rituals without complaint. Of course, they developed symptoms. The fatigue, the anxiety, the nameless dread. These weren't signs of a wandering uterus or an overstimulated nervous system. They were signs of a life that had become unbearable, expressed in the only language available to women who weren't permitted to simply say they were unhappy. Others suggest that hysteria, whatever its cause, became a form of resistance, a way for women to claim space, attention, and rest in a culture that demanded constant performance. The hysterical woman was excused from duties. She was permitted to lie down, to be cared for, to retreat from the endless round of calls and dinners and obligations. Her symptoms, real or performed, carved out a space of refuge within the prison of respectability. Illness became a kind of freedom, the only kind available. You close your eyes. The room is quiet except for the soft sounds of the house settling around you, the creak of floorboards, the distant clatter of pots from the kitchen, the murmur of servants going about their work. Your breath rises and falls, each cycle a small miracle of biology that you've been taking for granted all day. The heaviness is still there, beneath everything, but it feels more manageable now, more bearable. You have an hour before you need to transform again, before the evening's performance begins. An hour of something almost like peace. The chaise is comfortable beneath you, the blanket warm against your legs. You think about nothing and everything, the calls you made this morning, the charity hall, the shopping, the endless parade of faces and dresses and teacups. It all blurs together into a kind of pleasant haze, events losing their edges, time becoming soft and pliable. This is what rest feels like, you suppose. This suspension between one obligation and the next, this pause in the relentless forward motion of a life you didn't choose, but must continue living. The shadows lengthen on the ceiling. Somewhere in the house, A clock chimes the quarter hour. Your maid will return soon to begin the process of reassembling you for dinner. But for now, for these few remaining minutes, you simply breathe. The hour passes like honey dripping from a spoon, slow, golden, reluctant to end. But end it must. And soon your maid reappears to begin the process of tightening your stays once more, restoring the architecture of respectability that the rest period briefly dismantled. You feel the familiar compression returning, the ribs drawing inward, the breath growing shallow again. The interlude is over. The performance resumes. But before dinner, before the next costume change, before the elaborate ritual of the evening meal, there's a small window of time designated for what the Victorians charmingly call accomplishments. These are the acceptable hobbies of a well-bred woman, the arts and skills that demonstrate refinement without suggesting anything so vulgar as talent or, heaven forbid, professional ambition. You are meant to be accomplished, but only in the most decorative sense. Your accomplishments should adorn you like jewelry, visible proof of your breeding and your leisure, never threatening to become anything as serious as a vocation. You make your way to the small sitting room adjoining your bedroom, where your embroidery frame awaits like a patient pet. The fabric stretched across it is a fire screen in progress, a needlework picture that will eventually be mounted in a wooden frame and placed before the fireplace to shield delicate complexions from the heat. You've been working on it for 3 months. At this rate, it might be finished by spring. The design is a pastoral scene. Shepherdesses in improbable clothing, tending improbable sheep beneath improbable trees, all rendered in silk threads that cost more than a housemaid's monthly wage. You settle into your chair and take up the needle. The thread is a pale blue, meant to suggest sky, or perhaps a distant hill. You've forgotten which. Honestly, though it hardly matters, the motion of stitching is soothing in its repetitiveness. Pierce the fabric, pull the thread through, pierce again, pull again. The tiny holes left by the needle form patterns that will eventually coalesce into something recognizable. For now, they're just points of light against the linen, a constellation being born one star at a time. Here's a mainstream fact about Victorian women's accomplishments. They were explicitly designed to be useless. That was the point. A woman who could embroider fire screens, paint watercolors, play piano, and speak passable French was demonstrating that she had the leisure time and financial support to pursue activities with no practical application whatsoever. Accomplishments were class markers, proof that you didn't need to do anything productive to survive. The more useless the skill, the more impressive its possession. No one actually needed another embroidered fire screen. That's precisely what made embroidering one so valuable as a social signal. The needle moves in and out, in and out. The silk whispers against the linen with each pass, a sound so soft it's almost subliminal. The room smells of beeswax, candles, and the faint lavender of the sachet tucked into your work basket. Outside the window, the last grey light of afternoon is fading into the blue-black of early evening. You can hear, distantly, the sounds of the household preparing for dinner, the clatter of plates being laid, the murmur of voices from the servants' domain below. But here, in this small room, time moves at the pace of thread through fabric. Your watercolors sit in the corner, untouched for weeks. A half-finished landscape rests on the easel, a view of the lake at your family's country estate, rendered in the soft, slightly muddy colors that characterize amateur work. You're not bad at watercolors, actually. You might even be good, if you were permitted to practice with any seriousness, to study technique, to pursue improvement as a goal, rather than a pleasant diversion. But that's not how accomplishments work. You're meant to be good enough to display your work on drawing room walls, to show visitors when they inquire about your hobbies. You're not meant to be so good that questions arise about how much time you've devoted to it, or worse, whether you might have professional aspirations. Here's a quirky tidbit that reveals the strange boundaries of acceptable female artistry. Women were encouraged to copy existing works rather than create original compositions. Copying demonstrated skill and taste, without the troubling implications of creativity or self-expression. An original painting might suggest that a woman had ideas of her own, thoughts and visions that demanded expression. A copy suggested only patience and a steady hand, qualities far more appropriate to the feminine ideal. Some art instructors actually discouraged their female students from developing personal styles, fearing it would make them unmarriageable. Artistic genius in a woman was considered almost as alarming as intellectual genius. You set down the embroidery and move to the pianoforte in the corner. This is another accomplishment, perhaps the most important one: the ability to play music at a level that entertains without intimidating. Every well-bred young lady learns piano. It's part of the standard package, along with drawing and French, and the ability to make pleasant conversation about nothing. You've been playing since you were 6 years old, when your tiny fingers first struggled to span an octave, and your governess rapped your knuckles with a ruler when you struck wrong notes. The piano lid is already raised, the keys gleaming in the lamplight like a set of perfect teeth. You settle onto the bench, arrange your skirts around you, and place your fingers on the familiar terrain of ivory and ebony. The first notes of a Chopin nocturne emerge, tentative at first, then flowing more smoothly as muscle memory takes over. The sound fills the small room, rich, melancholy, the kind of music that seems to speak of things too profound for words. Your hands move almost without conscious direction, following patterns they've traced hundreds of times before. This is the closest you come to real expression, you sometimes think. Music allows emotions that speech forbids. You can play a piece that aches with longing, that trembles with barely suppressed passion, and no one will comment on the impropriety. It's just music, after all. It doesn't mean anything, except it does, of course. It means everything, in the only language you're permitted to speak fluently. Some scholars argue that accomplishments, despite their decorative purpose, gave Victorian women genuine creative outlets in lives otherwise devoid of artistic expression. The embroidery, the watercolors, the music. These were spaces where women could exercise skill, make aesthetic choices, create beauty in a world that treated them primarily as ornaments. Other historians suggest that accomplishments were simply another form of constraint, channeling women's creative energies into approved activities that posed no threat to the social order. The fire screen would hang in the drawing room, the watercolor would decorate a bedroom wall, and life would continue exactly as before. The nocturne reaches its end, the final notes hanging in the air like questions that will never be answered. Your fingers rest on the keys, feeling the cool smoothness of the ivory, the slight roughness where years of playing have worn subtle grooves into the surface. The room is quiet except for the soft tick of the clock and the distant sounds of household activity. You could play another piece, you have time. Still, before the dressing bell rings, but something holds you back. The music has said what needed saying. More would be repetition. You close the piano lid gently, a gesture that feels almost like tucking something precious into bed. The embroidery can wait. The watercolors can wait. Everything can wait. Always waiting. Because that's what your life is. An endless series of waitings punctuated by brief performances. You wait for callers. You wait for meals. You wait for your husband to return from his club, for your children to emerge from the nursery, for the season to begin or end, for anything to happen that isn't scheduled on a calling card or penciled into a social diary. The dressing bell rings, its silver tone cutting through your reverie. Time to transform again. Time to become the evening version of yourself, more elaborate, more decorative, more thoroughly constructed than the morning or afternoon versions. You rise from the piano bench, smooth your skirts, and prepare to climb the stairs to your bedroom, where your maid waits with the evening gown and all its attendant complications. Remember that corset from this morning? The one that took 45 minutes to lace properly? You're about to become even better acquainted with it. Dinner dress requires tighter lacing, a more dramatic silhouette, a waist that suggests you've never eaten anything more substantial than air and ambition. The transformation awaits, and with it, the longest performance of the day. Your bedroom has been transformed in your absence. The curtains are now fully drawn against the night, the lamps lit to their fullest brightness, and the fire built up to combat the chill that seeps through the windows, despite the heavy drapes. Your evening gown is laid out across the bed like a sleeping body, acres of silk in a deep burgundy that will catch the candlelight at dinner, trimmed with black lace and tiny jet beads that wink like stars. It's beautiful. It's also an engineering project that will require at least an hour to complete. Your maid is already waiting, her face composed into the patient neutrality of someone who has done this 1,000 times before and will do it 1,000 times more. The afternoon dress must come off first, all those buttons, those hooks, those layers of fabric that took so long to put on this morning. She works efficiently, her fingers moving down your spine in a rhythm that's become as familiar as breathing. The dress pools at your feet. The petticoats follow. You stand in your corset and chemise, feeling the cool air of the room against your exposed arms. Goosebumps rising, despite the fire's warmth. The corset must be adjusted for evening. This is not a simple tightening, it's a recalibration, a reshaping of your body to meet the demands of a different silhouette. Evening dresses of this era feature lower necklines, fitted bodices that leave no room for error, waists that must be impossibly narrow to achieve the desired effect. Your maid unlaces the back of your corset and begins the process of relacing it more tightly, her knee braced against your lower back for leverage. You exhale slowly, deliberately, feeling your ribs compress as the laces draw closer together. Here's a mainstream fact about evening dress that explains much of this elaborate preparation. Victorian formal wear was designed to be seen by candlelight, not the harsh glare of electric or gas illumination. The fabrics, the colors, the elaborate trimmings, all were chosen to catch and reflect the soft, flickering glow of candles in chandeliers and wall sconces. This is why evening gowns were often made of silk, satin, or velvet, materials with a natural sheen that came alive in candlelight. It's also why colors tended toward the deep and jewel-toned, burgundy, emerald, sapphire, shades that appeared rich and warm in the golden light of flames. Under modern lighting, these dresses would look entirely different. Under candlelight, they were magic. The lacing continues. You can feel your waist narrowing, your posture straightening, your entire body being reshaped into the fashionable S-curve that the evening silhouette demands. The sensation is not quite pain, you've grown too accustomed to it for that, but it's a constant, low-level discomfort that colors everything else. Breathing becomes an act of careful negotiation with the boning that encases your ribs. Bending is nearly impossible. Sitting will require strategic maneuvering. You've been dressing like this for years, and it still surprises you how much the body can adapt to constraint. Your maid ties off the laces and begins the process of layering the evening undergarments over the newly tightened corset. A fresh chemise finer than the morning one, with delicate lace at the neckline that will peak above your bodice. A new petticoat, this one trimmed with silk ribbon and cut to accommodate the evening bustle, which is slightly different from the afternoon bustle in ways that matter deeply to dressmakers and very little to anyone else. The bustle itself is tied into place, a construction of wire and padding that creates the distinctive rear profile of the era. Here's a quirky tidbit about the mechanics of Victorian evening dress. Many formal gowns were so elaborate, so heavily trimmed, so encrusted with beading and embroidery and lace, that they could weigh 15 pounds or more. Women wearing these dresses were essentially carrying the weight of a small dog distributed across their shoulders and hips for the entire evening. Dancing in such a gown required genuine athletic ability, though no one would have described it that way. The physical demands of femininity were simply taken for granted. Invisible labor performed in silk and sweat. The gown itself is lifted over your head and settles around you like a luxurious cage. The bodice is scandalously fitted by any standard but evening wear, where low necklines and displayed décolletage are not just acceptable but required. Your shoulders emerge bare, your collarbones prominent, the tops of your breasts visible above the carefully constructed neckline. It's strange, this Victorian paradox. Modesty demanded coverage during the day, but evening dress revealed more skin than any daytime outfit would permit. The rules existed not to protect women's bodies, but to regulate them, to dictate precisely when and how flesh could be displayed. Your maid fastens the dozens of tiny hooks that close the back of the bodice, each one clicking into place with a small, satisfying sound. The skirt falls in elaborate folds, the silk rustling with every movement, the beading catching the lamplight and throwing tiny sparks of reflection across the walls. You turn to examine yourself in the full-length mirror, and the woman who looks back is someone almost unrecognizable from the creature who woke in this bed 12 hours ago. The transformation is complete. Or nearly complete. There's still the hair, the jewelry, the gloves. Your maid begins the process of adjusting your coiffure for evening, adding height, complexity, ornamental pins, tipped with jet and pearl. The hair must complement the dress. Frame the face. Draw attention to the neck and shoulders that the gown so deliberately exposes. Ringlets are arranged to fall artfully against your bare skin. A black velvet ribbon is threaded through the arrangement, echoing the trim on your dress. Nothing is accidental. Every detail has been considered, debated, decided upon, according to rules you've absorbed so thoroughly you no longer consciously remember learning them. Some historians argue that the elaborate evening dress of the Victorian era represented the ultimate objectification of women's bodies, reshaped, displayed, and decorated for the pleasure of observers rather than the comfort of the wearer. Others suggest that evening dress was a form of armor, a way for women to command attention and respect in social situations where they otherwise held little power. The gown announced status, wealth, taste. It demanded to be seen. In a world where women's voices were often silenced, perhaps clothing became a form of speech, loud, insistent, impossible to ignore. The jewelry comes last. A necklace of garnets to complement the burgundy silk, cool against your throat, heavy enough that you feel its presence with every breath. Earrings that catch the light when you turn your head. A bracelet over your gloved wrist, because yes, there are evening gloves too, white kid leather that reaches past your elbows, buttons running up the inside of your arms in a line so long that your maid must fasten each one individually while you stand with your arms extended like a martyr awaiting crucifixion. You look at yourself in the mirror one final time. The woman reflected there is polished, elegant, every inch the lady of the house prepared to preside over her dinner table. She is also exhausted, corseted, hungry, and increasingly certain that the effort required to maintain this illusion far exceeds any possible reward. But these thoughts don't show on her face. She has been trained never to let them show. The dinner gong sounds from downstairs, its deep bronze note reverberating through the house. This is your cue. The performance is about to begin. You gather your skirts, take one last shallow breath, and turn toward the door. You descend the staircase slowly, one gloved hand trailing along the banister, your skirts whispering against each step like secrets being shared. The house has shifted into its evening mode, lamps dimmed to flattering levels, candles lit in their silver holders, the smell of beeswax and roasting meat rising from below. Somewhere in the depths of the kitchen, the cook is orchestrating the final preparations for a meal that has been in progress since early afternoon. 8 courses await you, 8 separate acts in the nightly drama of dinner, each with its own requirements, its own silverware, its own unspoken rules. Tonight is not a large gathering, just a small dinner party of 12, intimate by the standards of your social circle. The guests have already assembled in the drawing room, where sherry is being served, and the low murmur of conversation creates a pleasant hum beneath the crackle of the fire. You pause at the threshold, taking in the scene. The men in their black evening coats and white waistcoats, the women in their elaborate gowns, everyone arranged in careful configurations that appear casual but are anything but. Even standing has rules. Even waiting for dinner requires choreography. Your husband materializes at your side, offering his arm with the practiced grace of a man who has performed this gesture thousands of times. You take it, feeling the solid warmth of him through the layers of wool and linen, and together you survey your domain. These are your guests, your table, your evening to orchestrate. The responsibility settles over you like another layer of clothing, familiar and slightly suffocating. Here's a mainstream fact about Victorian dinner parties that explains the elaborate ritual you're about to undergo. The order of procession into the dining room was determined by strict rules of precedence based on rank, title, and social standing. The highest-ranking gentleman present would escort the hostess that's you into dinner, while your husband would escort the highest-ranking lady. Everyone else fell into place according to a complex calculus of status that guests were expected to understand without being told. Getting the order wrong was a serious social error, one that could cause offense and be discussed disapprovingly for weeks afterward. The butler appears at the drawing room door and announces, in tones of quiet gravity, that dinner is served. A subtle shift ripples through the room as guests begin to arrange themselves for the procession. Lord Ashbury, the evening's ranking gentleman, an elderly baron with impressive whiskers and a tendency to discuss his hunting dogs at length, approaches you and offers his arm. You accept with a gracious smile that reveals nothing of your feelings about spending the next 2 hours seated beside a man whose primary conversational interests are canine genealogy and the declining quality of modern gamekeepers. The procession begins. You lead the way, your hand resting lightly on Lord Ashbury's sleeve, your skirts sweeping across the polished floors in a soft percussion of silk against wood. The dining room doors stand open, revealing the table in all its glory. White damask cloths, crystal glasses catching the candlelight, silver gleaming at each place setting, flowers arranged in low centerpieces that won't impede conversation across the table. The smell of the room is complex candle wax, starched linen, the faint green scent of the floral arrangements, and beneath it all, the savory promise of the meal to come. You take your place at the foot of the table, your husband sits at the head, and the guests arrange themselves according to the placement cards that have been set at each seat. This arrangement, too, has been carefully considered, balancing rank with conversational compatibility, ensuring that no one is seated next to someone they've recently quarreled with, or, worse, someone they find tedious. You've spent more time than you'd care to admit thinking about this seating plan, shuffling cards like a fortune teller arranging tarot, trying to predict which combinations will produce pleasant conversation and which will result in awkward silences. The first course arrives, a clear consommé, amber and glistening, served in shallow bowls with handles like delicate ears. The smell rises with the steam, rich, beefy, with undertones of herbs and a whisper of sherry. You lift your soup spoon, the rounded one, remember, scooping away from yourself, and bring the first taste to your lips. The liquid is warm and deeply flavored, a distillation of hours of simmering bones and vegetables, strained and clarified until it gleams like topaz. You take small sips, pacing yourself, knowing that 7 more courses await and that appearing to eat with actual appetite would be a grave error. Here's a quirky tidbit about the elaborate place settings at Victorian dinner tables. A formal dinner might require as many as 12 pieces of silverware at each place setting, arranged in a specific order that indicated which utensil should be used for which course. The general rule was to work from the outside in the outermost fork for the first course, then the next fork for the second course, and so on. But there were exceptions and complications. Special spoons for particular soups, specialized forks for fish, tiny implements whose purpose remained mysterious to anyone not thoroughly trained in the arts of formal dining. Guests who found themselves uncertain would watch their hostess and follow her lead, which meant you could never hesitate, never betray confusion about which fork was correct. Your certainty guided everyone else's. Conversation flows around the table in the peculiar rhythm of formal dining. You speak to the gentleman on your right during one course, then turn to the gentleman on your left for the next. This alternation is required, ensuring that no one is ignored and no one is monopolized. The topics are carefully neutral. The weather, recent theatrical productions, the state of the roads in the country. Politics is forbidden. Religion is forbidden. Money is never discussed. Scandal is acknowledged only obliquely, in raised eyebrows and meaningful pauses that convey information without stating it directly. Lord Ashbury is telling you about his prize-winning setter, a dog named Champion, whose bloodline apparently traces back to some canine aristocracy that predates the Norman conquest. You nod, murmur appropriate responses, and try to look fascinated while mentally calculating how many more courses must be endured before the ladies withdraw and you can escape to the drawing room. The fish course arrives sole again, you note, though prepared differently than at lunch, and you turn with relief to the gentleman on your left, a younger man with kind eyes and a tendency to actually listen when you speak. Some scholars argue that the rigid formality of Victorian dinner parties served an important social function, creating structured environments where people of different backgrounds could interact according to clear, shared rules. The etiquette was a kind of lingua franca, a common language that allowed everyone to participate without the anxiety of improvisation. Others suggest that the formality was itself exclusionary, designed to identify and embarrass those who hadn't been raised with the proper training. A misused fork could mark someone as an outsider more effectively than any accent or address. The courses continue their stately procession. The fish gives way to an entree of sweetbreads in cream sauce, which yields to a sorbet meant to cleanse the palate before the roast. The roast itself is a massive joint of beef, carved at the sideboard by a footman with surgical precision, each slice laid upon the plate with the care of an artist arranging a composition. Vegetables appear alongside potatoes, asparagus, something green that might be peas, and you take small portions of each, moving food around your plate in patterns that suggest consumption without requiring much actual eating. The candles flicker in their holders, casting dancing shadows across the faces of your guests. The conversation has grown slightly louder, slightly more animated, as wine loosens tongues and the evening progresses. Someone laughs at the far end of the table, a genuine laugh, not the polite titter that usually passes for amusement at these gatherings, and you feel a small spark of satisfaction. The dinner is going well. Your guests are enjoying themselves. The performance, whatever its costs, is succeeding. The sweet course arrives, elaborate confection of spun sugar and cream that looks too beautiful to eat and tastes of vanilla and roses. You take a single bite, letting the sweetness dissolve on your tongue, and set down your spoon with the finality of conclusion. The meal is nearly over. Soon you'll rise, catch the eye of the highest-ranking lady present, and lead the women from the dining room, while the men remain behind with their port and their cigars and their conversations about things that apparently cannot be discussed in female company. The candle nearest to you gutters slightly, sending a thin trail of smoke toward the ceiling. The smell mingles with the lingering sense of food and wine and flowers, creating something complex and distinctly Victorian. The aroma of abundance, of effort, of an entire household mobilized to produce this single evening of consumption and display. You breathe it in, shallow breaths that your corset allows, and wait for the signal to rise. You rise from your chair, and every woman at the table rises with you, a synchronized movement that looks spontaneous but has been rehearsed through countless dinners, countless evenings, countless performances of this particular ritual. The men stand as well, a gesture of respect that will last precisely as long as it takes for the last silk skirt to clear the doorway. Then they'll settle back into their chairs, loosen their waistcoats, and reach for the port that's already being decanted at the sideboard. Their evening is about to become considerably more comfortable. Yours is about to become a different kind of performance. The ladies process out of the dining room in a rustle of silk and murmured conversation, leaving behind the smell of roast beef and candle smoke for the lighter atmosphere of the drawing room. The fire has been built up in your absence, the lamps adjusted to flattering levels, the tea things already laid out on the low table near the settee. This is your domain now, the feminine sphere, where you'll wait 20 minutes, 30, sometimes an hour until the gentlemen finish their port and their cigars and their conversations about politics and business and all the things too important or too indelicate for female ears. Here's a mainstream fact about this curious Victorian custom. The separation of sexes after dinner was considered essential to proper entertaining. The official explanation was that ladies' delicate sensibilities needed protection from the coarse conversation and tobacco smoke that inevitably accompanied male after-dinner relaxation. The unofficial explanation was simpler. Men wanted to talk freely, without moderating their language or their topics for female company. The port and cigars were almost secondary to the freedom from feminine observation. You settle into your usual chair and accept a cup of tea from the housemaid, who materializes with the pot. The other ladies arrange themselves around the room, their gowns spreading like exotic flowers across the furniture. Conversation begins, lighter now than at dinner, unconstrained by the need to alternate between dinner partners or maintain the fiction of universal interest. Small groups form and reform, alliances visible in the angles of bodies, the inclinations of heads, the subtle positioning that indicates who is in favor and who is not. Mrs. Ashworth is holding court near the fireplace, describing a dress she saw at Worth's establishment in Paris, the famous couturier whose creations define fashion for the entire Western world. The other women listen with expressions of polite envy, mentally calculating whether their own wardrobes measure up. Lady Pemberton sits slightly apart, her face arranged in an expression of pleasant neutrality that suggests she's thinking about something else entirely. The younger women cluster near the piano, and eventually one of them is persuaded to play a Chopin etude, competently rendered, if not inspired. Here's a quirky tidbit about drawing room entertainment. The pressure to perform was constant but carefully calibrated. Every young lady was expected to be able to play piano, sing, or recite poetry when called upon, but she was equally expected to require coaxing before agreeing to display her talents. Eager performance suggested vanity. Excessive reluctance suggested false modesty. The ideal was graceful capitulation after precisely the right amount of gentle insistence, a negotiation so ritualized that everyone knew their parts before the first note was struck. The music fills the room, providing cover for conversations that might otherwise be overheard. You find yourself beside Lady Hartington, an older woman whose sharp eyes miss nothing and whose memory for social infractions stretches back decades. She's commenting on the Ashworth woman's dress, beautiful fabric but poorly fitted. She observes, the work of a lesser dressmaker trying to imitate Worth's style without understanding his techniques. You nod, contribute an observation of your own, and feel the familiar exhaustion of maintaining constant vigilance over your words. Some historians argue that the drawing room, for all its constraints, offered women a space of genuine connection. Here, away from male observation, women could speak more freely, share information and advice, form bonds that would sustain them through the isolation of their domestic lives. The conversation might seem trivial to outside observers: fashion, servants, household management, but these topics mattered deeply to women whose entire existence revolved around such concerns. Others suggest that even in the drawing room, women remained performers, competing with each other for status and approval, never truly at ease. The piano piece ends to polite applause. Someone suggests cards, and a table is arranged for whist. You decline to play. Your role as hostess requires circulation, attention to all guests rather than absorption in a single activity. Instead, you move through the room, ensuring that teacups are filled, that no one sits alone, that the evening flows smoothly toward its inevitable conclusion. Time passes strangely in the drawing room. The clock on the mantelpiece ticks steadily, but the minutes seem to stretch and compress according to their own logic. You've been waiting perhaps 45 minutes when the drawing room door finally opens and the gentlemen rejoin the party, bringing with them the lingering smell of tobacco and the slightly flushed look of men who've been drinking steadily since the soup course. Your husband catches your eye across the room, a brief acknowledgement, nothing more, and the evening enters its final phase. The reunited company mingles more freely now, men and women circulating in patterns that would have been impossible at the formal dinner table. Someone suggests more music, and one of the younger gentlemen is persuaded to sing a sentimental ballad about lost love that brings tears to several female eyes and knowing smiles to several male ones. The fire burns lower. The candles gutter in their holders. The evening is winding down, though no one will leave until the highest-ranking guests signal their departure. Finally, mercifully, Lord and Lady Ashbury make their move toward the door. This is the signal everyone has been waiting for. Within 15 minutes, the drawing room has emptied, the front door has closed behind the last carriage, and the house settles into the particular quiet that follows a party, the silence of relief, of duties discharged, of performances concluded. You stand alone in the entrance hall for a moment, listening to the sounds of servants beginning to clear the drawing room, the distant clatter of dishes being washed in the basement kitchen. Your feet ache inside your evening slippers. Your head throbs faintly from hours of careful conversation. Your corset has shifted during the evening, and a boning edge presses painfully against your lower rib with every breath. The evening is over. You've played your part flawlessly, gracious hostess, charming conversationalist, elegant ornament to your husband's table. No one saw the exhaustion beneath the performance. No one suspected the hollow feeling that's been growing in your chest all evening. The mask held, as it always does, as it always must. Your maid waits upstairs to begin the lengthy process of dismantling you for the night. You gather your skirts one final time and begin the slow climb toward bed, toward rest, toward the brief hours of darkness when you belong to no one but yourself. The scene shifts now, away from the intimate dinner party and towards something larger, grander, more terrifying in its scale. Picture yourself not in your own dining room, but in a ballroom, one of the great ballrooms of Mayfair, where chandeliers drip with crystal and candles number in the hundreds, where the floor has been polished to such a shine that you can see your reflection in it, distorted and dreamlike beneath your dancing feet. This is the London season, that annual migration of the upper classes from their country estates to the capital, and you are caught in its glittering, exhausting current. The season runs roughly from April to July, though the exact boundaries shift according to Parliament's schedule and the whims of fashion. During these months, London transforms into a stage for the most elaborate social theatre imaginable. Balls, dinners, opera performances, garden parties, morning calls multiplied tenfold. The calendar becomes a relentless succession of engagements that leave no room for rest, for reflection, for anything resembling a private life. You might attend 3 events in a single evening, changing gowns between each one, travelling across London in a carriage that has become a mobile dressing room. Here's a mainstream fact about the purpose underlying all this glitter. The season existed primarily as a marriage market. Young women of marriageable age were brought to London by their families and displayed at ball after ball, event after event, in hopes of attracting suitable husbands. The word displayed is not too strong. Debutantes were presented at court to the Queen herself, curtsying in elaborate white gowns, before being released into society like horses at an auction. Their value was assessed openly, their beauty, their deportment, their family connections, their dowries. A successful season meant an engagement. An unsuccessful one meant returning to the country in quiet disgrace, to try again next year or accept diminished prospects. The ballroom swirls around you now, a kaleidoscope of colour and movement. The orchestra plays from a gallery above, the music floating down through air thick with perfume and candle smoke, and the heat of 500 bodies in formal dress. The smell is overwhelming, flowers massed in every corner, the waxy sweetness of burning candles, the sharper notes of perspiration barely masked by eau de cologne. Women's gowns brush against each other as they pass, silk whispering against silk, the rustle of fabric, creating a constant underscore to the music. You watch the young women circling the room on their partners' arms, their faces fixed in expressions of pleasant animation that reveal nothing of the calculations happening behind their eyes. That gentleman is a second son, no title, limited income, not worth pursuing unless his elder brother is sickly. That one has gambling debts rumoured to exceed his annual income. That one, in the blue coat near the punch bowl, is heir to an earldom and therefore surrounded by mothers and daughters like sharks circling wounded prey. Every waltz is a negotiation. Every conversation is an audition. Every smile is a strategic deployment of limited resources. Here's a quirky tidbit about the mechanics of ballroom survival. A young woman's dance card was a physical object. a small booklet or card with spaces for gentlemen to write their names beside specific dances. Being seen with an empty dance card was social death evidence that no one wanted you. But having your card filled too quickly suggested over-eagerness, a desperation that was equally damaging. The ideal was a card that filled at a steady pace throughout the evening, demonstrating popularity without impropriety. Some mothers arranged for trusted family friends to claim early dances, ensuring their daughters wouldn't be seen standing alone while the music played. The waltz was particularly fraught with significance. Unlike the more formal country dances where partners barely touched, the waltz required actual physical contact, a gentleman's hand at your waist, your bodies moving in close coordination, faces inches apart for the duration of the dance. When the waltz first became fashionable in England, it was considered scandalous, practically indecent. By your era, it's accepted but still carries weight. A gentleman who requests multiple waltzes with the same young lady is making a statement. He is declaring interest. He is, in a sense, staking a claim. You remember your own season, years ago now, though the memories have softened with time into something almost pleasant. The terror of your court presentation, curtsying before the Queen in a gown so heavy with embroidery you could barely walk. The endless balls where you smiled until your face ached, danced until your feet blistered inside your satin slippers, made conversation with young men whose names you forgot the moment they returned you to your mother's side. The relief overwhelming, almost shameful when your engagement was finally announced and you could withdraw from the competition, your future secured, your value confirmed. Some historians argue that the season, despite its marriage market brutality, offered young women one of their few opportunities for agency. Within its rigid rules, there was room for strategy, for choice, for the exercise of intelligence in pursuit of personal goals. A clever young woman could maneuver herself toward a desirable match, avoid an undesirable one, shape her own fate within the constraints available. Others suggest this agency was illusory, a fiction that made palatable what was essentially the sale of women to the highest bidder. The choices were all made within a system designed to benefit men, and any power women wielded was borrowed, conditional, easily revoked. The music swells and fades, swells and fades. You watch a young debutante being led onto the floor by a viscount twice her age, her smile bright and brittle, her mother watching from the sidelines with barely concealed anxiety. The girl is pretty, well-dowered, from a good family. She'll do well, probably. She'll secure her match, make her marriage, begin the long process of transforming from daughter to wife to mother to dowager. The cycle continues, generation after generation, each young woman believing her season is unique, while walking the same path countless others have walked before. The candles are burning lower now, their light growing softer, more forgiving. The ballroom has thinned slightly as older guests begin to take their leave, but the young people remain, determined to extract every possible moment from the evening. Somewhere a girl is falling in love, or thinks she is. Somewhere a mother is securing an introduction that will change her daughter's life. Somewhere a young man is working up the courage to request a second waltz, knowing what it will signal, hoping she'll say yes. You turn away from the dancers and find a quiet corner where you can rest for a moment, your back against a pillar, still cool despite the heat of the room. Your dancing days are behind you, married women. Don't compete in this particular arena, but you remember what it felt like. The hope and the fear, the exhaustion and the exhilaration, the sense that everything depended on these few months, these few dances, these few carefully chosen words. It was terrible. It was thrilling. It was the closest thing to freedom you'd ever known, even as it was designed to end your freedom forever. The orchestra begins another waltz, the melody drifting through the overheated air like a memory of something beautiful and lost. The carriage carries you home through streets quieter now, the hour grown late enough that even London has begun to surrender to sleep. The gaslights flicker past the window in a hypnotic rhythm. Yellow pools of light separated by stretches of shadow. The city reduced to impressions rather than details. Your head rests against the leather seat, your eyes half closed. the exhaustion of the day finally permitted to show now that no one is watching. The corset still grips your ribs, but you've stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing a headache that's lasted too long. It's simply part of you now, this constant low-level discomfort, as familiar as breathing. The house is quiet when you arrive, the servants having retreated to their attic rooms except for the footman who waits to open the door, and your lady's maid who waits upstairs to begin the final ritual of your day. The entrance hall smells of extinguished candles and the lingering ghost of dinner, roast beef and flowers, wine and wood smoke. The grandfather clock ticks steadily in the darkness, marking time that suddenly seems precious. These few remaining hours before morning brings a new round of obligations. You climb the stairs slowly, one hand on the banister, your skirts gathered in the other. The silk whispers against each step, a sound that's followed you all day, that will follow you again tomorrow. The gaslight on the landing has been turned down low, casting long shadows that make the familiar hallway seem strange, almost unfamiliar. Your bedroom door stands open, warm light spilling out, your maid's silhouette visible against the glow. Here's a mainstream fact about the nightly undressing ritual. It took nearly as long as the morning dressing, sometimes longer. Every hook that had been fastened must now be unfastened. Every pin that had been placed must now be removed. The elaborate architecture of hair and fabric and boning must be dismantled piece by piece, the constructed woman taken apart to reveal the human being underneath. Some ladies found this process soothing, a gradual release from the day's constraints. Others found it merely tedious, one more task to endure before sleep could finally claim them. Your maid begins with the jewelry, the garnets lifted from your throat, the earrings unclipped, the bracelet unfastened from your wrist. Each piece is returned to its velvet-lined box with care, treasures being tucked away for safekeeping. Then the gloves, those endless buttons running down the inside of your arms, each one requiring individual attention. The kid leather peels away from your skin, leaving faint marks where the seams press too tightly. Your hands emerge pale and slightly damp, finally free to move without constraint. The evening gown comes next. Your maid works down the row of hooks at your back, her fingers moving with the automatic efficiency of long practice. You feel the bodice loosen, the grip around your ribs easing slightly, though the corset beneath still holds you in its embrace. The gown pools at your feet, a burgundy puddle of silk and beading that cost more than your maid will earn in 2 years. She gathers it carefully, drapes it over a chair to be brushed and inspected before being put away. Tomorrow, it will hang in your wardrobe, waiting for its next performance. The petticoats follow, then the bustle, then the layers of undergarments that separate your body from the world. Each removal brings a small relief, a slight expansion of possibility. You can bend a little more, breathe a little deeper, move with something approaching naturalness. The room smells of your own perfume, released by the warmth of your body throughout the long evening, mixed with the more intimate sense of exertion and exhaustion. Here's a quirky tidbit about Victorian hair care. The elaborate styles that took an hour to create were not actually taken down every night. Hair washing was a weekly event at most, and the complex arrangements of braids and curls were often simply pinned into a protective cap for sleeping, to be refreshed rather than rebuilt the next morning. The amount of pomade and oil required to maintain these styles meant that pillowcases needed frequent changing, and the smell of a bedroom in the morning could be quite distinctive perfume and hair product, and the particular staleness of sleep. Your maid unpins your hair now, removing the jet ornaments, the velvet ribbon, the countless pins that have held the structure in place. Each pin makes a small sound as it's dropped into the porcelain dish on your dressing table, a gentle percussion that marks the progress of your dismantling. Your hair falls gradually, released from its constraints, tumbling down your back in waves that still hold the memory of their arrangement. The weight of it against your shoulders feels strange after hours of careful styling, almost too heavy. The corset is last. Your maid unlaces it slowly, giving your body time to adjust to each increment of freedom. The sensation is extraordinary, your ribs expanding, your lungs filling properly for the first time since morning. your entire torso seeming to sigh with relief. The boning has left red marks against your skin, lines and indentations that will fade by morning but serve now as evidence of the day's constraints. You press a hand against your stomach, feeling the softness that the corset concealed, the human body that fashion requires you to hide. A nightgown is slipped over your head, soft cotton, white, high-necked and long-sleeved. The fabric settles against your skin like a whisper, so light after the heavy silks of the day that you almost feel naked. Your maid brushes your hair, long, slow strokes that ease the tension from your scalp, and the sensation is so soothing you feel your eyes beginning to close. The brush whispers through your hair, whispers, whispers, a sound like leaves rustling in a distant garden. Some historians have noted that the relationship between a Victorian lady and her personal maid was one of the most intimate in her life. This woman saw you at your most vulnerable, undressed, unguarded, stripped of the armor you wore in public. She knew the secrets your clothing hid, the imperfections your corset corrected, the exhaustion that your smile concealed. Yet she was also a servant, a member of a different class, someone you likely knew very little about as a person. The intimacy was entirely one-directional. She knew everything about your body. You probably didn't know if she had siblings. Your maid helps you into bed, adjusting the pillows, drawing up the covers. The sheets are cool against your skin, clean linen that smells faintly of lavender and starch. The fire has burned down to embers, casting a dim orange glow across the ceiling. The room is quiet, except for the soft sounds of your maid tidying away the remnants of the day, closing jewelry boxes, hanging garments, extinguishing candles one by one until only a single flame remains on the nightstand. She curtsies a small gesture, almost invisible in the dimness, and withdraws, closing the door softly behind her. You are alone at last. The silence settles around you like a second blanket, and you realize this is the first true solitude you've experienced since opening your eyes this morning. 14 hours of constant company, constant performance, constant awareness of being observed. And now, finally, the dark and the quiet and the soft weight of the blankets and no one watching, no one judging, no one requiring anything of you at all. You stare at the ceiling, where shadows shift and dance in the ember light. Your body feels strange without the corset, expansive, uncontained, almost formless. Your mind drifts through the day's events, already beginning to blur together into a general impression of effort and exhaustion. The calls, the charity, the shopping, the tea, the dinner. The endless performance of being exactly what everyone expected you to be. Sleep approaches slowly, softly, like a tide coming in. The darkness holds you now, soft and complete. The single candle on your nightstand has burned down to a stub, its flames small and flickering, casting just enough light to make the shadows seem alive. The house has grown quiet around you, that particular hush of a sleeping household, where even the servants have retired to their attic beds, and the only sounds are the settling of old timbers, the whisper of wind against window panes, the distant chime of a clock marking hours that no longer require your attention. This is yours. These dark hours, this stillness, this brief space between the end of one performance and the beginning of another. For a few hours, you belong to no one. No callers will appear at your door. No servants will knock seeking instructions. No husband will require your presence, your attention, your carefully arranged smile. The night asks nothing of you except that you rest within it, and for once, you can comply without negotiation. Your body feels strange in its freedom. Without the corset, your ribs expand with each breath, filling spaces that have been compressed since dawn. The nightgown lies soft against your skin, so light you can barely feel it. The mattress cradles you, the pillows support you, and the weight of the blankets is comforting rather than constraining. These simple physical sensations, comfort, warmth, the absence of pressure, feel almost luxurious after a day spent in the elaborate armor of respectability. Here's something the history books rarely capture: the loneliness, of privilege. All day you have been surrounded by people, maids and footmen, callers and dinner guests, servants and shopkeepers, and the endless parade of faces that populate a wealthy woman's world, and yet true connection has been almost entirely absent. Every interaction followed a script, every conversation moved along predetermined tracks. Even your husband, lying somewhere in his own bedroom down the hall, knows the wife he married rather than the woman who wears that title like a costume she can never quite remove. The fire in the grate has burned down to embers, orange and red pulsing gently in the darkness like a slow heartbeat. The warmth it gives is fading, but enough remains to keep the chill at bay. You watch the colors shift and change, patterns forming and dissolving in the ash, and your thoughts begin to drift in the way they only can when no one is watching. What would your life have been, you wonder, if you had been born in a different time? A different class? A different body entirely? The question has no answer, and perhaps that's why it feels safe to ask it here, in the dark, where no one can hear. Some historians looking back at this era will write about oppression, about the constraints that bound women like invisible chains. Others will write about the genuine pleasures of domestic life, the satisfaction of a household well run, a family well raised, a social position well maintained. Both perspectives contain truth. Both miss something essential. Because what the historians cannot capture is this moment, this solitude, this quiet conversation with yourself in the hours when the performance has paused and you can simply exist without purpose or pretense. The question is not whether you are happy. Happiness is a concept too simple for the complexity of your life. The question is whether you are yourself, and the answer is uncertain. You have spent so many years becoming what others required, daughter, wife, mother, hostess, lady, that the original person, the one who existed before all these roles accreted around her, has become difficult to locate. She's in there somewhere, you believe. She surfaces in odd moments, a passage of music that moves you more than it should, a shaft of sunlight through a window, the smell of rain on pavement, small reminders that beneath all the silk and whalebone, a human heart still beats. The candle gutters and steadies. The flame is very small now, barely more than a spark clinging to the last of the wick. When it goes out, the room will be completely dark except for the fading embers. You should feel frightened, perhaps, of that darkness, but you don't. The darkness feels like privacy, like protection, like the only space where you are permitted to be unfinished, uncertain, imperfect. Your eyes grow heavy. The thoughts that have been circling begin to slow, to settle, to blur at the edges. Tomorrow will bring another morning, another corset, another day of calls and correspondence, and careful performance. But that is tomorrow. Tonight there is only this, the warmth of the blankets, the softness of the pillow, the quiet rhythm of your own breathing in the dark. The candle flame flickers one last time and goes out. The darkness is complete now, velvet soft and absolute, and somewhere in that darkness you feel something loosen, not the corset, which is already removed, but something deeper, something that has been held tight all day, all week, all year, for as long as you can remember. In the darkness, no one can see you. In the darkness, you don't have to be anything at all. The fire is dimming now, its glow barely visible, just a faint warmth reaching toward where you lie. The room has grown still around you, and the silence feels like a blanket drawn gently over the world. Let your breathing slow. Let your shoulders sink deeper into the pillow. The day is done, fully and completely done, and you have carried it as far as it needed to go. Think of all the women who came before you, the Victorian ladies in their grand houses, their corsets and calling cards, their endless performances of grace. They slept in rooms like this one, watched fires burn down to embers, felt the same relief when the darkness finally came. They carried their days too, heavy and elaborate, and they set them down each night just as you are setting yours down now. There is a kind of communion in that, a thread connecting you across the centuries, To all those who have sought rest after long hours of being seen, the warmth is still here, gentle and soft. The quiet hums around you like a lullaby without words. Your body feels calm, your mind feels calm. Everything feels calm and safe and still. The performance is over. The audience has gone home. The stage is dark, and you can finally stop being watched. Let the images of the day fade now, the silk gowns and silver teapots, the calling cards and candlelit dinners. Let them blur and soften until they're just impressions, just colours, just the faint echo of a world that will wait until morning to demand your attention again. Right now, there is nothing to do, nothing to be, only rest, only warmth, only the peaceful drift towards sleep. The night holds you gently, the way it has held countless sleepers before. The fire is nearly out now, just the faintest glow remaining, enough to remind you that warmth exists even in darkness. Your eyes are closed, or closing, and the boundary between waking and dreaming has grown soft and permeable. You are safe here. You are quiet here. You are, for these few precious hours, entirely your own. Sleep comes now, gentle and deep, carrying you away from corsets and calling cards, from performances and obligations, from everything that daylight requires. The long day has ended. The silence welcomes you, and somewhere in the darkness, the woman you might have been smiles softly and takes your hand, leading you down into dreams where no one is watching, where nothing is required, where you can simply rest. Sweet dreams.